Good morning, and thank you for having me today at this day of ministry. It's been in my diary for a very long time, and discussions with David have been going on for a while. And then, of course, with the onset of the pandemic, who knew how it was going to work out? But this is a new venture for me via video, and hopefully it'll work well for us today. We're going to look at the story of Moses and the burning bush under the title "Called for Purpose." I mean, by way of introduction, my name is, as you probably know, my name is Nick Lugg. I have been a Christian minister for, many years now. 1994 was when I was ordained and inducted in a church called the King's Church in Addlestone in Surrey, and in total was there for 11 years. We had a year that I'll mention later. We were in Zambia for a year, and then eventually we left that church and moved to Zambia full time for almost 6 years before being called back to pastor the Wesleyan Reformed Union Church in Mexborough, which is now known as Mexborough Life Church, and we came back in 2010 and stayed there until 2019. Now living in Sheffield, not in full-time church leadership, but involved in ministry still in many ways, and also in charity work connected with all that we're doing in Zambia, and helping and supporting other charities through a small business called Pathfinder Charity Solutions. Married to Erica. Have been married for 27 years, and we have two sons, Aidan and Jacob. Aidan is, let me work it out, he's 25. You forget, don't you? He's 25 and he's a maths secondary teacher. And Jacob is 21 and he's training to be a pilot. And so, as we look back over many years, see the faithfulness of God to our family. Really pleased to be with you today and to have the chance to look into the scriptures. What I hope to do is to break down what I want to say into about 3 sections, and we'll pause briefly in between each one and go back live on Zoom, maybe for some chat and some discussion around some questions relating to what I've brought up. But as I've said, the title of what I want to say this morning comes under the banner "Called for Purpose." So why don't we read the scripture from Exodus chapter 3 and from verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. We'll stop there. Scripture says that Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. We know that Moses had a lot of history behind him. But at this point in his life, his purpose was clear. He was simply a shepherd of a flock of sheep. When he got up in the morning, the job of shepherding was all that was before him. He had no other agenda. He had no other purpose. That was his reason for existence. There was much more behind him, it seems, than there was in front of him. I wonder how easy it is we find to identify with that feeling. So much more behind us than there is ahead of us when we're young and we're looking into the future, there's, you know, the possibilities are endless. The whole world seems open to us, and yet it doesn't take long until you get to a stage where you think actually there's there's not that much ahead, and there's far more history that's been written about all that's gone before. Calling, purpose, destiny. They're all words and terms perhaps associated with a few, perhaps those that are younger than we are, those that are fitter than us, those that are better resourced than us, those that are in bigger churches than us, those that can speak better than us, those that are bolder than us, those that are more handsome than us. Maybe one might think there aren't any of those, but you know, there's always things that we use to disqualify ourselves. But here we are seeing how God came to an old man in the middle of the desert and mandated him to play a huge part in liberating his own people. If the call of God and our part in his purposes is dependent on anything else other than the God who calls us, then we'll always have a problem. We will never be enough. We will never be ready. We will never have the equipment that we need. The call of God originates in God himself. Our ability to fulfill that call, our strength, our talent is all totally irrelevant. He can take us from where we are to where he wants us to be entirely by his own resources. And that is liberating. That teaches us that he can call each and every one of us at any time into his own purposes, because he has enough within himself to equip us and resource us in order to make a success of it. And our external circumstances, just like Moses' external circumstances, were completely irrelevant. He was an old man tending sheep in the middle of the desert, and God came to him and gave him a life-changing and world-changing remit. That's the power of the call of God, when we realize that it begins and ends with him. And as the church, as the people of God, who have the value of obedience close to our hearts, we need to rediscover the fact that calling and identity for us begins in the heart of God and not in our own thoughts and imaginations. Not what we can tell ourselves about ourselves, not what others will tell us about ourselves, not what our history and our experience will tell us about ourselves, but what God himself will say. We'll have all sorts of objections, just as Moses did. But ultimately we have to listen to the voice of God, who's saying, this is what I see, and this is what I want you to do, and I am the one who will equip you and enable you. Sometimes we can overplay our own abilities and significance. Many times that's not actually the problem. The problem is that we underplay them and we disqualify ourselves when the criteria we use are all wrong. It's all about the God that we serve and not our talents, our abilities, our strengths, or our history. As a friend of mine once said, as I sat together with him, and an old man who just encouraged me so greatly in so many things of faith, and he said, you know, one thing you need to remember is there are no great men and women of God. There are only men and women of a great God. And that's true for each and every one of us, regardless of our circumstances, regardless of the defense that we'll put up, regardless of the yeah but that we'll put in place when God speaks to us. There are no great men and women of God, only men and women of a great God. Moses would certainly not have imagined all that God had for him to do. And if he did, he would have disqualified himself, without doubt. But here in the middle of the desert on an ordinary day, God met him and laid out his own thoughts and plans for Moses' life. I wonder how we feel if we just allow God to speak to us about what he sees. Somebody once said that, you know, there was a time when the servant of God said, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." But many times we say, "Listen, Lord, your servant is speaking," and we speak so much about what we are, what we can do, what's possible, what's not possible. And there's a time just to listen to what God is saying about us and about what he wants for our lives and for our churches. As we go about our everyday business, as we navigate our way through COVID-19, as we wrestle with the increasing challenges of a fast-changing culture, as we live in our own affective desert. Let us be aware that God can intervene in the most powerful ways and waken us up to a new purpose and direction, no matter how much water has flowed under the bridge. Do we still ask God what he has for us? What he wants us to do for him? Because while we have breath, we serve him. And Moses is a salutary reminder to us that there is always life. Where there is God, there is always life. Where there is always a possibility. There is always effectiveness. There is always an opportunity for us to serve him. None of us is on retirement. We all have the opportunity to respond to the mandate and the call of God. I want us to take a brief intermission in the session now, just to think about and try to apply some of the thoughts that I've brought to our own lives and experience. Some of the questions I have are along these lines. Is your expectation of what God can do affected by factors such as getting older, past disappointments, inadequacy in our own eyes? What other factors are there when you think about God doing something new, something different, something powerful in our lives or through our lives? What are the things that just hold us back from really believing that can happen? What are those factors? It's important for us to understand the things that limit us in our faith and expectation. Secondly, how do we overcome those barriers? The barriers caused by our own self-assessment of ourselves and our circumstances rather than God's assessment and believing that what he says can change circumstances. So how do we, it's one thing to recognise the barriers, it's one thing to recognise the hindrances, but any ideas about how we can actually begin to overcome those things in our mind and in our heart? And thirdly, do you have any testimony to share of how God has intervened in your life in surprising ways and shown his power either to you or through you in the past? It'd be very interesting. It's always good to hear people's testimonies, and it encourages our faith and builds our expectations. So is your expectation of what God can do affected by factors such as getting older, past disappointments, inadequacy? What other things are there that hold us back? And how do we begin to unravel those things, to unpick those things so that they become less of a hindrance, and so we can become more alert to the possibility of what God might be able to do through us? And do we have testimonies of how God has intervened in our life, perhaps in surprising ways, and shown his power either to us or through us? So let's have a chat.